It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator and our guest speakers. Please note full bios are available at your table. I'll be quick. Sunil Kumar joined Chicago Booth in 2011 as Dean and as the George Pratt Shultz Professor of Operations Management. Before joining Booth, Professor Kumar spent 14 years at Stanford, where he was a professor of operations, information, and technology. His research interests include performance evaluation, control of manufacturing systems, service operations, and communications networks. Alan S. Blinder is the Gordon S. Rentschler Memorial Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. Dr. Blinder served as Vice Chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve from June of '94 to January of '96. Before becoming a member of the board, Dr. Blinder served as a member of President Clinton's original Council of Economic Advisors from January '93 to June '94, and he was in charge of the administration's macroeconomic forecasting. He also worked intensively on budget, trade, and healthcare issues. So, Glen Hubbard, Professor Hubbard, is Dean and the Russell L. Carson Professor of Finance and Economics at Columbia Business School. From 2001 to 2003, he was chairman of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors during President Bush's administration. In the corporate sector, he sits on several boards, including ADP, BlackRock, and MetLife. And Professor Hubbard is co-chair of the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation. He's past chair of the Economic Club of New York, and he is past co-chair of the Study Group on Corporate Boards. Could we give a warm welcome to this group? Thank you, gentlemen. Sunil, it's yours.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm going to start with a definition that appeals to me. And as you can imagine, with 3 professors on the dais, this is going to feel like class. The test is until 1:25. American Dream. The definition I'm using is from James Truslow Adams, an author who wrote a book called The Epic of America in 1931. It is not a dream of motor cars and high wages merely, but a dream of social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they are innately capable and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the circumstances of birth or position. That, of course, is the topic of today's discussion. How real is this dream? What is the situation on upward mobility? And this is a charged topic, so there is a need to be somewhat clinical about it, somewhat dispassionate. And so we'll structure our discussion in 3 ways. First is an assessment of the current situation. How far away from the ideal that I just described are we? What are the contributing factors that lead to this situation? And then prescriptions. After all, our speakers have advised the leaders of this land, as you saw from the bios. So what would they go to the mat for is perhaps a good point to end on. With that, I'd like to ask Alan to start by summarizing the situation with his opening remarks.
Thank you, Sunil. Let's see if that worked. It did. That's the first. So I just want to set a factual stage, really. And then we'll go on from there to things like causes and cures. So what you see here first is a graph of a particular measure of inequality. This is the so-called Gini Index. If you don't know what that is, it doesn't matter. When it goes up, it's more inequality. When it goes down, it's less inequality. For census family income. Family income is measured by the Census Bureau. It's the longest time series we have. Goes back to 1947. And what you can see is that it's been on a pretty much inexorable upward climb since around the late 70s. You could argue about exactly when it started, but it's around then, not before. So this is not a fact of nature that this always goes up. Second, I just want to, excuse me, write up on the screen 2 statements that you often hear. The first is that there's a great deal of income mobility. so that lifetime inequality is much less than annual inequality, and, which is what we were just looking at. And the upshot of that is we don't worry so much about annual, whoops, I must have touched this. We don't worry so much about annual inequality because, you know, people are poor when they're students and then they get rich later, and who cares? False statement. The United States, which you hear all the time, the United States has more mobility than most countries do. This is the American dream part. And so inequality of the sort we were just looking at in that graph isn't anything to worry about very much because of shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, if not indeed 3 years. So here's the fact. This chart shows you a measure of intergenerational inequality. You could think of it as the heritability of earnings from father to son, from mother to daughter, and so on. And I can't read this too well from here, but what you see on and the countries are ordered. These are the rich countries, OECD countries. What you see on the far left are countries like Denmark, Austria. I can't read what the next one is. You can, Norway, thank you very much. And there's an arrow which I added. This is not my graph. This came from an OECD publication. I added the arrow pointing out where the United States is. So it is simply not true, although it's been it's been an American myth for a long time. Mythologized, that's the word I was looking for, that we have a lot more mobility than these other countries, and therefore we shouldn't worry so much about the one-year inequality. I just said that it's been believed for a long time. This is a graph from a paper by Raj Chetty and 3 co-authors showing, as best as anybody can show, this gets very difficult to carry back through time, back I think to, can anyone read that?
73.
Thank you very much. I need, at my age you need assistance reading. From 1973 until the early 90s, by birth cohort, when people were born, as best they could construct a measure of intergenerational inequality. And what you see there is it's flat as a board. So it's not that America has just become much less mobile when a generation ago we were super mobile. It's that we thought we were super mobile, but we weren't super mobile. And in terms of intergenerational mobility, we're roughly where we've long been. So a summary of this was named by my colleague, my Princeton colleague Alan Kruger, the Great Gatsby Curve some years ago. And what this is showing you is the correlation across a selected number of countries. You can't do this for every country, of inequality measured horizontally and intergenerational mobility measured vertically. And of course, it's not a perfect correlation, but there's an unmistakable positive correlation, meaning that as you look across the globe, countries with more annual inequality tend also to have less mobility, not more mobility. So you don't have an offset. And the last little slide is, this is where we live. That's the United States of America. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Alan. Before we start our discussion, I'd like to turn to Glen to give his assessment of the situation.
Well, thanks, Sunil. I think Alan set the stage very well. What I wanted to do was just remind everybody how big a question this is and how hard it is to grapple with it, because it depends on what you're asking. So I wanted to talk about some terms, a concept, and then how to address it. In terms of terms, is inequality rising? Well, it depends what your system is. Globally, it's not. It's actually falling quite a bit. In the US and in many industrial countries, it is certainly rising. Do we control for differences in age or family status? All of these are important variables. And what's the concept? So Fed Chair Yellen has given very, I think, important observations about rising inequality in income and in wealth. My colleague Wojciech Kopczak has written very well on wage inequality. And most of the explanations economists have generally center on 2 things: technological change and globalization. But I think there's a different concept we ought to be looking at. When we think about inequality, at least as economists, we're really talking about resources to finance your consumption over your life. That is a kind of living standard definition. So I think of that as something like a present value of a household's remaining future lifetime expenditures. Recent work by economists has constructed measures like this, and they lead to similar trends but very different pictures. So depending on the cohort at which you're looking, the top 1% would have about half the level of relative spending power as they do wealth. So in other words, wealth is much more concentrated than true spending power, and that would be true for the top 1%, 5%, 20%, and again, the differences aren't small, they're on the order of half. The second kind of concept we ought to think about, and Alan mentioned, is mobility. And here I read this as good and bad news from the extremely important work that Raj Chetty and his co-authors have done. And if you're not familiar with his work, you should Google Raj Chetty and have a look. And it's based on tens of millions of anonymous tax records. And the mobility rate is largely held steady, as Alan pointed out, in recent decades, although it is lower in the United States than it might be in Canada and in Western Europe. There is a cautionary tale. While that lack of deterioration sounds like a glass half full, the glass half empty is this. Because inequality has risen at the same time, the birth lottery becomes much more important. So a child born to a low-income family would be more disadvantaged today, relatively speaking, than when I was young. In terms of thinking about issues going forward, I suspect if I asked all of you, would you like to see 50 more Bill Gateses or Steve Jobs in our economy? You would probably, if you're like any other audience ever asked that question, the lights are too high for me to ask it to you and see your hands, you'd say yes. Yet, of course, a consequence of that would be substantial inequality. I think what we think about as important from a policy perspective is not how many Bill Gateses and Steve Jobs there are, but to make sure that what drives income gains at the top really are returns to business skill and extraordinary investment as opposed to rent seeking, and that we try to make sure that individuals in the lower initial incomes have access to education and opportunities. A postscript I'd like to leave you with. We're all talking about inequality today. This is Super Tuesday, and this will be a big issue across the country. But don't forget that while we tend to diminish today the fact that a rising tide could lift all boats, it's more or less still true. We should not let legitimate concerns about inequality interfere with our desire for growth. I'd commend you to a study done by the Obama administration's Council of Economic Advisors that suggested that if we had the high productivity growth, high underlying growth of the 1948 to 1973 period after 1973, but we did not change, we had an equal definition or equal distribution of income, that is no change post 73, incomes for the average person would be $30,000 higher. If we did it in the reverse, if we use the actual slower growth but no change in inequality, that difference would be only $9,000. Growth matters more.
Great. Thank you both. And let's start with kind of trying to reconcile some of your statements with the facts, and in particular, this notion of relative versus...
I thought I was going to
did that come out wrong? Sorry, Glenn. What I meant to say was the following. The facts were about relative measures.
Correct.
The index that was put up was a relative measure. You made a statement about absolutes. Alan, would you care to comment on that? And so this is just trying to get this reconciled. I wasn't accusing Glenn of making up stuff.
I would, without disagreeing with anything Glenn said. But in terms of emphasis, the Bill Gates, Steve Jobs simile Glen is no doubt correct that we would all like to see more people like that, and the country would be better off if we had more people like that. Although I learned from his biography Steve Jobs wasn't too good at taking a bath. But anyway, despite that, he was very good at designing computers and things like that. But if you just look at wages, so Bill Gates and Steve Jobs didn't get rich through wages. If you look only at wages, forget about all income from capital, the rise in inequality is stunning, stunning. A graph that I like to show but didn't pick for these first few that I showed a few minutes ago compares the wage gains over about a third of a century from 1979 to 2012. If I'm remembering the numbers right, what you would see if I had this graph here was that at the lower 10th percentile, the lower 10% real wages have declined over 33 years by a modest amount. The median has gone up only about 5%, not per year, 5% over 33 years. And the upper 1% has gone up 154%. That's just wages. Capital income's on top of that. That's purely wages. The other thing I would like to put a slightly different slant, though not disagreeing, what Glen said is correct, is that there has been in recent years, and by some measures in recent decades, a sharp disjuncture, which is not has not been historically the case, but is the case recently, between wage growth and productivity growth. That wages have grown much more slowly than productivity, so that the average worker is no longer being rewarded for the sweat of his or her brow, as was true for a very long time. It is doing worse. Arithmetically, that means the capital share of national income is rising. That was not true for a long, long period of time, but is true in recent decades. And finally, on top of that, it has become important in recent decades not to just look at the average, but to look at the dispersion. So if you compare, for example, the median wage, the person at the 50th percentile in the distribution, to the average wage, a large gap has opened up in that respect in recent decades.
A couple of things. First, on the issue of wages and consumption, which I referred to, and then also to actually answer your question about absolute versus relative mobility. While everything Alan said on wages is true, again, if you look at consumption, you get a different picture. And it's intuitive as to why you're getting a different picture. We have a very progressive tax system, and we have massive transfers. And so it's not surprising that inequality in spending levels looks different than inequality in wages. We deliberately and rightly, as a country, lean against that. To your question about mobility definitions, the intuitive way I think of it is imagine an escalator. If we're all standing on the escalator and the escalator is moving up, then think of that as like absolute mobility. The dollar incomes are rising. If we start changing places, if I try to run up ahead of you on the escalator and get faster, that's relative mobility. And so it's possible to have one and not the other, and that's why it is important to get the definition right.
So let's turn to causes, and this is one of the texted questions as well as one of the things that I had prepared. Looks like the website's working, so please go ahead and text. So on causes, you showed the OECD bar graph. That could be interpreted two ways. Perhaps if you had seen the graph 50 years ago, it might have looked differently. I don't know about that. But the question I'm leading up to is, are we just running slower than everybody else in the world? And so consequently, is this a consequence of other countries working better and we losing our competitive edge? Or is this something more inherent in our system itself? So perhaps I'll throw that question to both of you.
Well, I think it depends on what measure you're looking at. Inequality has risen almost throughout the industrial world. And the same factors of technology and globalization that drive it in the United States drive it elsewhere. Governmental intervention through taxes and transfers does vary across countries, but the pre-tax market outcome movements, I think, are very similar. Where I think the U.S. has a disadvantage that it needs to focus on is not so much about the dispersion, but about the relative lack of skills of many lower income workers. That we're not investing enough in education and training of those workers.
I think the answer to your question, Sunil, depends on what your comparison group is. The group that I showed there was OECD rich countries, basically, and it's not the case that we're underperforming in average relative to those others. You bring in China and India, it's a whole different story. And some smaller places like Vietnam and a whole bunch of others where over the last generation, say, the gap between the average income in China and the average income in the United States has moved dramatically, as everybody knows. And that's why when sometimes people look at world inequality and they say, well, world inequality has actually shrunk. And that's mainly a story about India and China doing so relatively well compared to rich countries. The other thing I want to say is just to pick up on something that Glen just remarked about. To the extent that technology is a major driver of greater inequality, it's largely, as Harvard economists Larry Katz and Claudia Golden put it, I think this is a title of a book, or it's very close to a title of a book, The Race Between Education and Technology. That's either the title of the book or it's almost that. So technology is racing ahead and education is not going up quite as fast, or maybe nearly as fast. Glen touched on that. And so it's the losing that race, so to speak, that has led to the widening of inequality of pre-tax transfer income. So you could think of that as market wages, but it's also income from capital. A major difference between the United States and most Western Europe countries is to what extent we and they use the tax transfer system to counteract that market force. And the truth is, no matter how you cut it, we do less. We have a less generous tax transfer system than Western Europe does. That means, among other things, lower marginal tax rates, so there is a plus side to that. And the broad sweep of American income, let's stick with income taxes for simplicity, but you don't have to stick with income taxes. The broad sweep of American tax policy since the Reagan Revolution has actually been in the opposite direction, not making our tax transfer system more redistributive, but making it less redistributive.
So let me hold off on the technology education part. I'll come back to it. But now that we are on taxes, Glen, I want to give you your chance to weigh in on that.
Well, I do think that there's more we need to do in the tax system. I actually think that lower marginal rates in the U.S. are actually a good thing for the country. But we're not doing enough to reward work. The Earned Income Tax Credit is a great program, but it has morphed from principally a work support program more to a family support program. We need a significant expansion in things like the Earned Income Tax Credit to make work pay for more people. It's not just about the current income someone has. To use the escalator metaphor again, the escalator won't go up if you don't, or for you, if you're not even on the escalator. So we have to reward work. That we're not doing a good enough job at.
So let me come back to the.
Could I just underscore?
Sure.
I agree with that and want to underscore a point that's just not very well understood. If you actually look at the numbers of the Earned Income Tax Credit, what it provides is a very generous subsidy for having more children and a negligible subsidy if you don't have children for working more. That seems not like what we meant it to be when it came into the code.
Well, we have one possible prescription already agreed upon in this panel, so that's good. I intend to call the Trump campaign and let them know.
He never heard of the earned income tax credit. You'll have to explain what it is.
I'll let that one slide without comment and bring it back to the issue of education and the interplay with technology. One way to think of, for example, the export of jobs elsewhere is to say, well, we should build barriers for these jobs going elsewhere. We should continue to keep doing what we did well 30 years ago. The other way is to say, make everyone catch up to where we ought to be. So could you comment on education and perhaps, and I think at lunch, Glen and I were sharing our personal stories. For both of us, our real kind of entry into the stream of work that put us here was a test. We took a test in high school, which we did very well on. And that got us into the right college in some sense and got us up from there. So what do you think is the situation and the causes of, in terms of education and kind of getting on the escalator?
Well, I think if you ask politicians, they will agree, which means you must know it's wrong when politicians of both sides agree on something. And what they agree on is that we should try to put the genie back in the bottle. We should make America what it was 30 years ago, 50 years ago, in the industrial composition, the way the labor force looked. That's not going to happen. But education could be doing much more to develop skills, not only in conventional primary, secondary, tertiary education, but retraining skills. And we just don't do enough of that as a country. Politicians seem less interested in that than talking about bringing back manufacturing, but the latter is more important.
Alan, your thoughts on?
I'd like to agree very emphatically with that. A recipe for failure is to try to go back to the industrial structure based on the comparative advantages we had in the United States 20, 40, 60 years ago. It's in the natural order of things, I don't mean this in a moral sense, but an economic sense, that those activities migrate to poorer countries, which helps them get richer, by the way, which is not a bad thing. The recipe for success for America is to keep climbing the technology ladder. We're doing that. We could do it better, but we're doing it pretty well. I don't think it's an accident that in this information age, or whatever you want to call it, most, not all, of the big breakthrough innovations have happened in America. We're good at that. What we're not so good about, and that comes at the top. Either you start at the top or you wind up at the top. So that's your Steve Jobs. I mean, Bill Gates went to Harvard, so he wasn't exactly
dropped out, but he did.
Yeah, he was a Harvard dropout.
Yeah.
But he did go to Harvard, so it looks like he was probably doing okay as a youngster. We're very good at that. We're not so good at several things. First, K-12 education in poor districts. I went to a very good high school in suburban New York. That was fine. A lot of the country's not like that at all, including some parts of Chicago and some parts of New York and everywhere. We should be doing a better job at that. Secondly, pre-K education. Every American kid should be getting high-quality pre-K education. The evidence of the efficacy of that education, the pure financial rate of return, ignoring any moral uplift or any duty, forget about all that. Just be like an economist. I want to know the dollars and cents. What's the return? It's enormous, and the evidence is strong and deep and almost without exception. Some of it, by the way, comes right out of this town, from Jim Heckman at the University of Chicago. But he's not alone. It's not like he's the lonely voice. Everybody that has studied this has come up with the same conclusion. And then finally, the place where we are, or another place where we are really disgracefully inadequate, and where lots of other countries are doing better, is in vocational education and apprenticeships. So this is for the kids who are not going to go to Princeton and Harvard and the University of Chicago, but are perfectly capable of earning very good livings as electricians, carpenters, plumbers, you name it. And we don't really give those kids a break. There's very little vocational education, and where we really fall down in international comparisons, I don't know if you know this, some of you may, is apprenticeships. The number of young American boys and girls, or young men and women, that are in apprenticeships is negligible compared to most of Western Europe. And I think for reasons I don't understand, Australia leads the world in this. I don't know why, but you know, they speak English like we, well, sort of, like we do, so why can't we do that?
A related question is on immigration. So, you know, there's a question that was texted to me, and which says, you know, it's of course drawing correlation from one bar graph that you put up there, that many of those countries have low levels of immigration, the things that you showed having less inequality. Would both of you care to comment on the impact of immigration on upward mobility in this country? And
well, there's two stories of immigration in the country, and they get confused sometimes in political discussion. One is very high-skilled immigration. So, for example, at my school, 40% of my students are not Americans. It would be my dream that every one of those young men and women got to work in this country. And I would say the same if I were dean of an engineering school. Maybe not a law school, but other than, but certainly for other things. So that debate gets conflated with the debate over low-skilled workers. I don't think anybody thinks that if we have additional non-American high-skilled people, that's somehow bad for the wages of the rest of us. There is a legitimate debate for low-skilled people. I happen to have a particular point of view there, but I agree that debate's legitimate. The debate that isn't legitimate is over high-skilled people, and that's really the mobility question.
I agree with that, and where it leads me to, and a lot of people that think the way I do, but not everybody, is to thicken the social safety net for the people that are going to be the victims of low-skilled immigration. They've drawn a bad lottery in life anyway, and letting in more immigrants that are going to compete for jobs and income with them, but not with me, seems unfair. And we ought to be doing more to help these people.
So let's turn to the kind of potential prescription things. And there have been various changes in policy in the 30-year period that the Raj Chetty's plot covers, yet the thing hasn't moved that much. So I suspect you're not going to come up with a pat magic bullet that will fix everything in the next 90 seconds. So I thought we'd take some time to talk about potential prescriptions. So you have both advised presidents. Let's assume you're going to advise a future one. And in that hypothetical scenario, what would you pick as your kind of thing to go to the mat for? You know, the one prescription that you think would do it, and why?
Well, I think there's no silver bullet. Anybody tells you he or she has one is making it up. But I do think there are a couple of things. Remember, politicians tend to have shorter time horizons. So what we would have as truisms in our profession about the importance of education and training, they're no doubt true, but a politician won't reap the benefit. I do think, though, if you marry those sensible long-term policies with policies that reward work, which is another way I would say what Alan referred to in the safety net, wage subsidies, things that really help lower skilled people in the here and now, while at the same time making greater investments in education and training for the future. I think those are the bullets we have to fire.
I would fire two bullets, one of which I've already said, but I'll underscore it in a second. But the first is to run a high-pressure economy, a tight labor market. The only time in the 30-year period I was showing on that first slide in which inequality did not rise in the United States was basically the second Clinton administration. Now, that's not about politics, not because Bill Clinton had a nice smile. It's because the labor market was tight and firms were scrambling for workers. And by the way, among other ways you scramble for workers is take workers that don't quite have the training yet that you want, and you train them yourself, because you need those workers. So a high pressure, a low unemployment economy, I put as numero uno on the list. And the second thing I would I won't repeat it, just very briefly to bring it back up, was education for disadvantaged people or non-advantaged people, let's put it that way, in pre-K and K-12 and in vocational and apprenticeships, like I said.
Well, thank you both for teeing those two up, but let's take the education one that both of you agree on. It'll be a while before that kicks in, right? So there's a transition period which for this generation is basically could be a lifetime. And so how do you cushion the blow while people are getting scaled up to take the jobs that will result in an economy that has a tighter labor market?
You're quite right. There's a difference in making an argument for somebody who's very young about how to change over his or her lifetime versus somebody who's, let's say, my age, who's lost his job, and then what happens. I think we need to do much more in training and income support for people like that. For years, I've tried to champion, to very little avail, I have to confess, things like personal reemployment accounts that would give transfers to individuals for individual training and income support. Again, part of this metaphor of rewarding work. That we can do in the here and now. That's not a 50-year payback. That's a right now thing. The problem is, on the left, people want to only talk about unemployment insurance. On the right, people would rather change the subject, and we don't have the conversation.
Alan?
No, I agree with that. The truth is that the things we know that work best and can make dramatic changes are education, let me call it that, of very, very young ones. And by arithmetic, that's going to take a generation. You educate 3-year-olds better, and they're not going to be in the workforce for 15, 20 years. And that's when you see the diminution of inequality. For the people that are already adults, including young adults, it's too late for anything like that. And so you're on to the social safety net, the tax transfer system, or things like Glen, including things like what Glen was just saying. We don't do enough on job retraining. By the way, there's a very widespread myth that job retraining doesn't do any good because they're training people for the wrong jobs that don't exist and so on. And of course, there's always instances of that. But to my knowledge, the basic estimates of the returns to job retraining are similar in magnitude to the rates of returns of education in the K-12 system. They're in the same ballpark. So we don't think that's a waste of money, giving young Americans K-12 education. So I don't think we should think of job retraining as a waste of money either.
So I was charged with moderating a debate, and I feel the level of concurrence is uncomfortably high. And so I have to, necessarily inject some potential conflict. And so I would like to switch to something I know nothing about, namely politics. So
everybody knows nothing about that.
Right, but feels free to talk about it.
Let's take the earned income tax credit. Feels like a no-brainer. 2 different CEAs under different administrations, people say this is a good idea. So why did you guys whiff on it when you were in the CEA?
Well, I think this is going to happen. If you look at proposals, not only is the Obama administration interested, but Paul Ryan, who's now the Speaker of the House, both Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio in presidential campaigns on the Republican side suggested this. So I think it's going to happen. What happened, at least in my time, Alan can speak for himself, is what I had said earlier, which is the left just is so wedded to broken programs, the unemployment insurance system, that it's not willing to entertain a new discussion. And the right just doesn't want to have the discussion at all. I think the difference is, at least on the right, there are thoughtful people like a Paul Ryan that are now leading this discussion, and that's why I'm optimistic for change.
Alan?
Well, when I was on the CEA under Bill Clinton, it was in the beginning of the Clinton administration, we didn't whiff on that at all. The single thing I'm most proud of that the Clinton administration did in its first several years was roughly triple the EITC. And we got that through Congress. What we didn't realize at that time was what I alluded to before, and Glen did too. They were thereby gigantically opening the gap between childless workers and workers with children. We weren't like deliberately trying to do that. It was kind of an oversight. So the policy correction that both President Obama and Speaker Ryan have advocated, I hope Speaker Ryan is still on this now that he's Speaker. When it was Congressman Ryan he was, and I hope he still is, I don't know, is basically to lift the benefits in the EITC for the childless workers. They're both proposing more or less the same thing, and if you want to know the answer, why isn't that passing the Congress, it's the same answer to the question, why isn't anything passing the Congress now?
So let's keep going down this perhaps gloomy path of future implementation of some of the ideas. So let's just ask the question, given the upcoming election, which candidate do you think has the best chance of implementing some of these ideas? And I use the word best chance simply because it's not up to just the president to implement these, and so it requires much more than that to implement some of the ideas you're talking about.
Some of the candidates appear to believe that the president alone can do this, but they need to go back and take their civics course if they ever had one again. To my mind, there's a lot of good discussion in this campaign. If you look at policy papers, you're just not hearing it. That's not what these debates have been about. It's crazy what we're covering. But one person who left the race, Jeb Bush, had a lot of ideas on this. Marco Rubio has a lot of ideas on this. I think the sitting president has a lot of good ideas on this. So we are not short of ideas. We're short of discourse. It's very hard for a candidate to make change if he or she has not talked about that change with the American people in the election. Unfortunately, we're not talking about any ideas in the current campaign.
Let me take a little exception to that. First, the answer to your question is Hillary Clinton by a mile. Secondly, in terms of we're not talking about it, that is a central issue on the Democratic side between Bernie Sanders, who is rather far too left for my taste and for a lot of people's taste, and Hillary Clinton, who's more of a left, in what in European argot we would call center-left, as opposed to far left. They are talking about that quite a bit, and it's a central part of the Democratic side, and unfortunately it's not really getting any prominence at all. Well, in the current stage, no issue is getting any prominence in the Republican side, unfortunately. It's all about sticking your tongue out at the other guy. That'll change, I hope. Well, I hope. I pray in the general election. And it is a classic difference between the two parties. Democrats have for a very long, you can go back to Roosevelt and before, have a history of trying to do something about inequality, sometimes well, sometimes clumsily, but always trying to do something about it. And as we were saying before, there's plenty left to do. And the Republican Party typically, there have been some exceptions to this, but typically has taken the attitude, I mean, you did ask about politics, right? Has taken the attitude, well, markets are markets and they do lead to inequality, but markets are really important, so, we live with it. It's a very different attitude.
Glenn, I have to throw that to you.
Yeah, I guess I would take exception that the Democratic campaign is ideas rich here. Senator Sanders is basically just trying to build an unaffordable European welfare state in the United States. I don't think there are any new ideas there at all, and I would think Mrs. Clinton's is a lighter version of that. I think if we're going to have ideas, they will come from the people definitely not in the race, the Paul Ryans of the world, who will have them. But I think we will see this discussion. Whoever the president is, whether he or she is Democrat or Republican, this issue is now too important. The one thing one can say about Trump is that he did detect this populist feeling. And I think that's not lost on any of the politicians. Whoever winds up winning the presidency will have to pay attention.
So that actually ties to a question that I just received, and which is, There were two questions, and I'm combining them. One of them was to ask you to elaborate further on why not leave it the way it is going forward. After all, for the last 30 years, it's been this way. The country, one could argue, has done okay. Why not leave it the way it was in terms of both mobility and inequality? And the second one is why is a potential negative impact of this the stridency and anger that you see among parts of the electorate right now in this election season? So maybe I can open that topic.
Just something that Alan said earlier, I think a key thing we have to do is address concerns over long-term growth. One of my teachers, Ben Friedman, wrote a book some years ago that I would commend to anyone called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, noting that populism, racism, anti-Semitism rise in very slow growth societies. We are seeing some of this right now play out in the United States. We really have to invest in growth. I'm less worried about inequality per se. I'm much more worried about poverty and skills gaps at the bottom than I am rich people. Maybe it's because I'm a business school dean. That's just not a huge concern for me.
If I can.
Sure.
I'm not so worried about rich people either, but I'm very worried about wage inequality, which, as I said, has become, to my way of thinking, but not to everybody's, unconscionably large in the last 30 years, much larger than it ever was in our history. I don't pretend to understand the incredible anger that is obviously the story of the election so far. I would understand it if it wasn't getting manifested in a character like Donald Trump, who's a billionaire. I understand it when it comes through Sanders, right? These are the people that haven't got wage increases and see their standards of living rising, not rising, and see rising inequality and get resentful about it. How that focuses through Donald Trump is a mystery to me, making me think I'm missing something. There's something I'm not understanding. But the other aspect of it, which I think is clear in both parties, is this is slightly ironic, the gridlock in Washington. As I just said, as Glen said, as everybody knows, you can't get anything done in Washington now, whether it's a conservative agenda that you'd like to get through or a liberal agenda that you'd like to get through. It's just no, 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 and nothing happens. And I think part of the anger is directed at that. You see that in the high esteem in which the U.S. Congress is held. I mean, they're down to friends and family when it comes to who likes the Congress. There's nobody else that does. But it's infected other institutions. I mean, I've looked up twice because I was writing some things. What's the right way to put it? It's not public esteem, but the public's opinion, high or low, of the Federal Reserve, which we three, and probably everybody in this room, hold in extremely high esteem these days. It's way down low also. It's like down there with the IRS. So we have managed to get the country angry at everybody somehow. That can't be a good thing.
I'll take, we have about 5 minutes, or a little more than that, 10 minutes left. So one cause that we haven't talked about here, and which is, of course, pertinent, is race as a driver of inequality. Would both of you care to comment on that? You know, how much of it is a driver? How do you think this gets mitigated, and so on?
Well, there's no question that race is a factor in inequality in the country, particularly in wealth measures, even more than income. There are very large white-black differences in wealth accumulation. This, again, though, gets back to some of the same discussion we had before about education, training, and investments that have to be made. I don't think the bullets are any different, but the problem is definitely there.
Well, as Glen said, it's arithmetically obvious that part of the inequality problem is a racial problem. If you look at black-white differences in almost anything you can think of, educational attainment, wages, employment rates, et cetera, blacks are disadvantaged And so it's a matter of arithmetic that some of the inequality is racial. By the way, some of it is also gender-based, with women not getting paid as much as men. That's arithmetic. What do you do about it? Well, you know, we've had a racial problem in this country since the beginning of the country. Some of us still remember and not with pride, the 3/5 compromise. That was in the good old days when people were doing things right. So this has a very, very long history, and I'd like to think it's getting a little bit better over time. I think it is, but it's slowly, and we're not nearly where we need to be. I come back again to the things that I was talking about earlier. I used the term disadvantaged people, families whose children don't get the quality pre-K education, don't get a good K through 12 education, go to college less, don't get vocational training. Those people are in every racial and cultural group you can think of, but a lot of them are black people. And if we could really invest in a program, a serious program, that would devote more resources to all of those things, black people would benefit disproportionately.
I'd like to end the debate on one question, which is, I think, among the things you agreed on the somewhat unseemly long list of things you agreed on.
Invite Donald Trump next time. I mean,
they'll find a different moderator for that. I'd like, Michael, one last question. So, which is the following. We know that nothing much will happen in DC, at least in the short term. Is there something the business community can do, or should it, to address this issue of mobility in the country? You're looking at the business leadership of the city here.
The answer is yes. There was a time in our country when business leaders stood up and were counted on big issues. The Marshall Plan, for example, in the United States was a great intervention. It was not the brainchild of the Congress. It was a brainchild of business leaders. Nobody has more to gain, frankly, in an economic perspective from the changes we've talked about than the business community. And seeing the business community come up with specific ideas, press political leaders on them, is important. And I think that too often we see CEOs, very keen on talking about things that affect their firm or industry, as they should. But I think it's time to stand up and be counted. And this is an issue on which they should do so.
I agree with that very much, and I would just, as a codicil to that, add pushing for a high-pressure economy with tight markets, which is good for business, by the way. Right. Wages go up in those environments, but so do profits. And the last thing I would say is that while we economists like to pretend that wage structures, so how much does the low guy earn, the middle guy, the upper guy and gal earn, are completely determined by markets, and the business leaders are incapable of doing anything about that, I don't believe that for a second. And so I believe in the internal management of businesses, some things could be done to mitigate a bit. It won't be revolutionary, to mitigate inequality a bit.
Well, I hope we have given, the panelists have given you something to think about. And with that, let me turn it back to Michael. Thank you all very much.
So this is back on. Alan, Glen, Sunil, thank you so much. It proves that we can have reasoned discourse here at the Economic Club of Chicago. Thank you three for doing this today, and I come away optimistic. Thank you all. We stand adjourned.